Psalm 18 is really very unique in many ways. It's a long psalm. It's got 50 verses, and it is classified as a song of thanksgiving. And it is essentially a personal testimony of David as he reflects back over a long season of his life where he has been in conflict with Saul and with foreign nations, and he has experienced deliverance in battle, and now he is presumably firmly established as king. And so he reflects back on this season of his life and gives God thanks for his presence. So it's classified as a thanksgiving psalm. But also, because David is king, some will also put this in the category of a royal psalm, and as it describes how God takes care of and delivers the king in battle. Krieghauser gives this one key word assignment to this psalm, and that is the word theophany. A theophany is a God appearance. God shows up, and that's a pretty good way of summarizing the content of this psalm. Now, this psalm has a very clear context. In fact, it is quoted in its entirety back in 2 Samuel chapter 22. This is positioned at the end of David's life. Now, he may have written it sooner, earlier in his life. He may have written it in all likelihood, perhaps even before Absalom's rebellion. We don't really know. But it does seem to be a summary of David's life, and it is repeated in its entirety here as Psalm 18. The superscription tells us that David addressed the words of this song to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So, definitely the hand of Saul, we know that situation where Saul was pursuing him. Saul was the king and refused to give over leadership to David, and so he pursued him. And the other instance here is he delivered him from the hands of all his enemies. So does this include his son Absalom and that rebellion, or is it previous to that? We just don't know, but clearly it's a psalm that expresses the excitement and the victory of a military leader who has seen his foes completely vanquished. The psalm begins with the statement, "I love you." It's the only twice does that occur in the book of Psalms. Also in Psalm 116 is the other occurrence. It's not the typical word for love. It's the word that suggests compassion, mercy, and it really indicates intensity of emotion. There are 7 metaphors or descriptors of God in the first couple verses here. So the first is, "O Lord, my strength," my rock is stated twice, my fortress, my deliverer, the one that comes and rescues me. It's my rock in whom I take refuge. He is my shield who protects me, the horn of my salvation. This is the only offensive weapon described here, the horn of salvation, referring to the horn of an ox, a pointy thing that could do some damage, and then my stronghold. So notice that most of these are defensive, protective type positions, with the horn of salvation as the offensive weapon and the Lord as my active deliverer. So there could be something to be said for the fact that there are 7. 7 is a number of completion or perfection. And so here we have 7 metaphors, names of God and his actions for David. I think perhaps the key verse theme of this psalm would be summarized in verse 3. "I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies." If you want to summarize 50 verses into one, there you have it. It's interesting that verses 4 through 6 correspond in many ways to the prayer of Jonah. Now, Jonah lived several hundred years after David, so it's possible that David was incorporating these words in his prayer while he was in the belly of the fish, as he called out, and from the cords of Sheol to the belly of Sheol, Jonah prays. "In my distress I called. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. My prayer came to your holy temple." So those phrases occur in both prayers, and the whole idea of the cords of death, the torrents of destruction, corresponding to the waters closing around, weeds wrapped around my heads like the cord of Sheol. So there seem to be some parallels there. I should note that the word temple here suggests God's heavenly temple, I think. The earthly temple hadn't been built yet. It was still a tabernacle in David's day. It was a tent. However, we do have references to the temple in 1 Samuel 1 9 and 3:3, when clearly the temple hadn't been built yet. So, but I think because the prayer is directed towards God, it's probably referring to God's heavenly temple, although God dwelt on earth in his tent, in his tabernacle as well. So probably not a big deal either way. So David cries, he's in distress, and Yahweh responds with dramatic effect. And we have listed here a number of seismic and meteorological phenomena. The earth reeled and rocked, the foundations of the mountains trembled, quaked because he was angry. It suggests an earthquake, most likely. Some have also suggested just it could be this thunder rattling things. Smoke from his nostrils, devouring fire from his mouth, glowing coals flowed forth from him. That sounds to me a lot like a volcano, although again, some commentators say, no, this is thunder and lightning, the fire being the lightning striking the ground and burning things. Verse 9, he bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. That sounds like a thunderstorm with dark rain clouds. He rode on a cherub and flew, came swiftly on the wings of the wind. So we have the power of the wind and the storm. Darkness is covering, canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. So a heavy rainstorm. And then out of the brightness before him, so it could be lightning, hailstones, coals of fire broke through the clouds. So it's difficult to say that all of those are one event. It seems like it's a kind of a combination of all the powerful images from creation that God was seen to be behind. We see a lot of anthropomorphism, that is, God being portrayed in human form, and we see some personification where inanimate objects, natural phenomena, are described as if they were humans. So anthropomorphism, we have God's nostrils, his mouth, and his feet, verses 8 and 9. And for personification, might suggest that the mountains trembling being a human attribute, possibly. So the word cherub in verse 10 is a common word in the Old Testament, occurs 91 times, seems to be an order of angelic being, and these were represented above the Ark of the Covenant. There were a pair of them that overshadowed the Ark of the Covenant. They are considered to be throne angels. That is, they hang out in God's presence in heaven, constantly worshiping him night and day. They're also the guardians of the Garden of Eden, some kind of angelic being. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon that takes place when a volcano erupts, where lightning can occur in the ash cloud. And here's a picture of that. You can find these elsewhere, and it's a beautifully powerful, fascinating phenomenon. So some have suggested that David here is describing this because it does seem to incorporate all of those elements. There was seismic activity in the ancient Near East, particularly around the Dead Sea, the Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. But throughout the area, there is seismic activity, and so perhaps David had witnessed something like this, combined it all into one. We mentioned the cherub. Here's a depiction of a cherub from the 10th century Neo-Assyrian. So this is not Israel, but this is about 100 years after the time of David. So it describes what other ancient peoples thought of when it came to a cherub. In the book of Ezekiel, which of course is much later, we have the cherub depicted as having 2 pairs of wings, as you see here, and 4 faces. That of a lion, representative of all wild animals, an ox, representing domestic animals, a human face, representing humanity, and an eagle, representing a bird. So it seems to be a creature of tremendous power and glory. And, of course, David says, well, God rides on that like a beast of burden, like you might ride a horse. So clearly, as great and glorious as a cherub might be, Yahweh is greater. We have again a return to descriptions of God as he thundered in the heavens, uttered his voice, hailstones, coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed lightning and routed them. That sounds a lot like arrows being a metaphor for lighting. Verse 15 suggests the Red Sea crossing. Now, David wasn't one who personally experienced that, but he says the channels of the sea were seen, the foundations of the world were laid bare. So it's possible David here is describing a storm in the desert, a sudden rainstorm, again, anthropomorphism in verses 13 and 15. And then David describes his deliverance as he sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. That image of drawing out of many waters is a significant one because we think of all the way back to the time of Moses, who was drawn out of water, out of the Nile River, placed there in a basket by his mother. And his name, in fact, Moses, means drawn out. Israel, of course, was figuratively drawn out of the waters as they passed through the Red Sea. And even in verse 15, if that's a reference to the Red Sea crossing, there's a connection here with Israel being drawn out of the waters. And then, of course, Jonah had that same kind of experience of being drawn out. And then we do as well in our baptism. So think of your baptism in that context. He drew us out of the waters of death of baptism and raised us to life. Verse 17, he rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, who were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. Sounds a lot like the earlier Psalm 16, where David described how he was placed in a broad place. And again, corresponding to the prayer of Jonah, perhaps back in verses 4 through 6, moving from a place where you're confined and entangled by seaweed and the cords of death, and then to be out in a spacious place was certainly a blessing. What was the reason for God's salvation that David experienced? David credits it to David's own righteousness. He says that twice in this section, verses 20 and 24. David declares that he was rewarded because of his righteousness. And he describes how he kept God's ways, followed his rules, kept himself from guilt.